Hello, listeners. It's Gunter Swoboda here with some exciting news. We're on the lookout for sponsors to join us on our incredible journey with Inspired Change with Gunter. If your organisation cares deeply about meaningful conversations around masculinity, self development, and mental health, we'd love to partner with you. Our podcast has a wonderful, dedicated audience committed to personal growth and positive social change. By sponsoring Inspired Change with Gunter, your brand will connect with listeners who truly value thoughtful discussion and support initiatives that promote real transformation. We're incredibly proud to be ranked number one in Australia and number 5 in the USA on FeedSpot's top men's mental health podcasts. For more information on how to become a sponsor, please reach out to Miranda Spigener-Sapon, our showrunner and executive producer. We'd love to explore how we can work together to inspire change. Now, thank you for your continued support, and let's keep inspiring change together.
You're listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. To guide us through the intricacies and intersections of emotions, relationships, and male identity is renowned psychologist, author, and speaker Gunter Swoboda. This is Inspire Change.
Before I begin the actual podcast, I would like to respectfully acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which I work. I would also like to pay my respects to their elders past and present. Welcome everybody to another episode of Inspired Change with Gunter. I'm your host. Welcome everybody to another episode of Inspired Change with Gunter, where I take a look at redefining masculinity and cultivating personal growth through deeper introspection and some authentic conversations. I'm Gunter Swoboda. I'm a psychologist and I'm the creator of Making Good Men Great and the framework that goes with it. In today's episode, I'm going to take a look at healing emotional wounds in order to process pain to foster growth. Now, I'm going to take us through a little bit of an expanded journey that includes ideas about what these wounds are, what trauma is, the profound legacies, and the essential relationship between healing and meaningful growth. So, what is an emotional wound? And what's trauma? So, in order to truly heal, we need to first clearly understand what we're talking about when we talk about emotional wounds. The way that I see it is that emotional wounds result from experiences that overwhelm our psychological resources. Though individual resilience and available support systems significantly shape how deeply these wounds affect us, often leaving lasting scars on our psyche. For some people, they don't necessarily recognise that they're carrying an emotional wound. What about trauma? Okay, so there's a couple ways of looking at trauma. One is trauma can stem from an overt, intensely distressing event or events, such as physical and or emotional violence, abuse, significant loss. But it can also be through subtle chronic conditions like neglect, emotional abandonment, sustained criticism, or in some instances, prolonged high levels of stress. Now, these experiences can feel unbearable, leading to feelings of helplessness and disempowerment. The impact of these wounds can become deeply embedded within our identities, influencing our beliefs about ourselves, our sense of worth, and how we interact with others. Now, the legacy of trauma often spans generations, perpetuated when unresolved emotional wounds ripple through families and communities, creating cycles of pain, dysfunction, and emotional disconnection. Now, recognizing this intergenerational pattern can be crucial for breaking the cycle and empowering us to create healthier, more connected future relationships. So, as all things in life, there are often consequences. So, in this case, I'm going to talk about the symptoms of emotional wounds. And these manifest across multiple dimensions in our lives, and they're often not necessarily connected with together. It's sort of we see one but not the other. Often people recognize that they're psychologically wounded, but they don't see the effect that this has on their body. So let me talk about and go through it from bottom up. In other words, let's talk about the physical symptoms first. So this often results in chronic fatigue, frequent tension headaches, digestive disturbances, compromised immune function, sleep disturbances, chronic pain, and or persistent muscular tension. I'll give you an example. Let's call him John. He often experienced persistent headaches and stomach issues during stressful periods at work, reflecting unresolved stress-related emotional wounds. Now, much of that was often attached to deep-seated sense of perfectionism, because underlying all of that, he had a very deep narcissistic wound where he didn't feel or believe that he was good enough. So let's move into the psychological realm. So what do we see there? Well, commonly what we see is anxiety, depression, heightened irritability, pervasive feelings of shame, guilt, inadequacy, worthlessness, emotional numbing, sometimes difficulties concentrating, and persistent self-critical thoughts. Another example here is that a guy that I worked with struggled with a lot of anxiety. That often led into depressive symptoms, and this happened particularly after losing his job. And what it brought up fundamentally was this idea again that he wasn't good enough, that maybe he was an imposter and that's why he lost the job. What it really boiled down to was that he was the unfortunate victim of a complete management shakeup. Had very little to do with him, but he took it on personally. There's also behavioural symptoms that go with this. And I'll call them symptoms because they're not just the behaviour in of itself. They're symptomatic. Some of this can be seen in people withdrawing, for example, from meaningful relationships. They have attachment issues in intimate relationships. Sometimes one of the things, especially as men, we tend to do is we self-isolate, or we use self-sabotaging behaviours. For example, like substance abuse, being a workaholic, being a chronic exerciser. Sometimes what comes with that is impulsive or aggressive actions. We, in that space, sometimes have difficulty maintaining boundaries. And there is, at times, a pattern of repeated involvement in toxic relationships, sometimes trying to subconsciously undo the poor relationship we had with a toxic parent. Now, again, let me give you an example. Here's Tom. Now, one of Tom's behaviours is that he often withdrew socially. and then would, rather than going out with friends and socialising and having a good time, would sit back at home and get drunk. And again, this is a indicator that there's a hint of something wrong, some sort of emotional wound. Now, these next couple of things that I'm going to talk about are sort of interrelated. I often find, especially working with men, that some of us at certain ages are prone to existential symptoms. Loss of purpose is a biggie. We have sometimes an existential dread, some sort of crisis that's looming in the future. We also experience a crisis of meaning through which we disconnect from ourselves and others. And through this are often struggling with our sense of identity. For some men, one of the things that happens here in the existential space is that we're frequently trying to get an answer to what our life purpose is. And, that can mean sometimes struggling deeply with feelings of emptiness, especially after a major relationship breaks down. So, awareness of these symptoms helps us to recognise when professional support might be useful, especially when it guides us towards seeking appropriate help rather than dismissing or minimising the signs of trauma. So what's going to help to heal? And this is where we need to start looking at the importance of therapy in healing. Engaging in therapy is pivotal for emotional healing. Professional psychotherapy provides structured, compassionate guidance to navigate the complexities of trauma. Therapists often offer a safe, supportive environment where my clients can uncover and explore and effectively process their deep-seated emotional wounds, some to a greater degree than others. But it's there. I talk about therapeutic approaches from psychoanalysis, cognitive behavioural therapy, attachment therapies, but most specifically, I talk about trauma-informed therapy, wherein existential humanistic methods can provide a variety of effective strategies. Now, fundamentally, some of these are one, to learn how to deal with symptoms, but also then, as we go deeper into psychotherapy, learn what the underlying traumas are that drive our symptoms. And all of this fundamentally is about helping us to regain control over our lives and emotions. So here's a point, though, that I want to drive home. Professional therapy alone isn't the entire solution. There's a space for self-therapy. These are usually practices that significantly enhance and reinforce professional treatment. I'll give you a good example. Individuals who consistently practice mindfulness and meditation often report a marked reduction in anxiety, increased emotional regulation, and a stronger sense of personal empowerment. Self-therapy includes personal practices like journaling, process your thoughts, your feelings, practices of mindfulness and meditation to ground yourself emotionally, and also to increase reflective self-inquiry. So there's lots of these tools that we can use to help empower ourselves and our clients. It's a two-way street. So there's therapy and there's self-therapy. We need to place our healing into our own hands and allow professional therapeutic outcomes to be complementary. So you heard me talk about earlier on that, in order to grow, we need to heal. And that healing fundamentally is a path to growth. Now, that's easier said than done. So let me focus you a little on the whole process of healing emotional wounds. Healing and growth are profoundly interconnected. In order to heal, I have to dig deeper. I need to be driving a deeper sense of self-awareness. This is a foundational component of personal development. As I've said in other episodes, self-awareness is everything. It opens up a gateway towards greater psychological flexibility, adaptability, and resilience. However, the idea of achieving balance, a commonly idealized state of complete harmony, is realistically unattainable. Imagine standing on a stand-up paddleboard out in the surf. Now, in order to maintain your balance on that board requires this continuous micro-adaptation, micro-balancing and flexibility to respond to a shifting environment, to shifting waves and changing conditions. Now, life mirrors this metaphor. It is inherently a dynamic, unpredictable environment, cosmos, which is filled with constant change. So, one, we can never be constantly in balance, nor is it always the same. Now, we need to embrace adaptability. Now, doing so means that I'm also going to be accepting imperfection and understand that setbacks are as integral to life as anything else. And thereby I'm cultivating resilience to thrive. So let me walk you a little bit through to this whole idea of going from awareness to adaptability, which is a common issue that I help my clients with. So moving through the dynamics of going into awareness to actually making some actionable change involves recognizing and addressing some of my common barriers for change. That might be fear, it could be deeply ingrained habits, external social pressures, and or limiting self-beliefs. Now, a practice that I've always found particularly useful in helping me in this space is Zen Buddhism. Zen offers a valuable example of how you can make this work practically in your life. Now, I'm not saying you need to give up whatever other belief or faith that you have. To me, Zen is a way of thinking and a way of being in the world, which highlights the very things that most of the time we teach in therapy or we work with in therapy. So part of the practice is to regularly engage in mindfulness, to meditate, to exercise self-inquiry. As an individual, I need to learn to observe my thoughts without judgment, so I can become better equipped to adapt flexibly to life's ongoing shifts and changes. So in this context, there are a couple of absolute key practices. One is acceptance. Now, as I said in one of the other sessions, sometimes acceptance is also about surrender. In that context, we need to embrace imperfections rather than strive for perfection. We need to embrace limitations. We need to recognize our vulnerabilities and that they're a natural aspect of the human experience. In rational emotive behavior therapy, we accept who we are as a person, flaws and all. right? I am not a perfect human being, and I will never be a perfect human being. Zen is the same. In Stoicism, it's the same. It's this sense of, abandoning the idea of things being perfect in a particular way. So it's a bit like, a graphic designer who notices a small flaw in his final design project. Now, instead of becoming frustrated or discarding his work, the artist embraces the flaw, seeing it as a reflection of his authentic creativity. He acknowledges that imperfection adds depth and character to his art. This reminds us all to embrace and accept ourselves precisely as we are. Now, that doesn't mean there can't be aspiration, right? But here and now in the moment, I am as I am. Coming back to that whole idea of perfectionism, one of the things that stands out in Sufism is that Sufi artists always put a flaw, consciously in their art. The other part of it is being flexible. You got to develop the capacity to respond to life's uncertainties with openness and creativity, rather than resistance or avoidance. Again, in Zen, there's a story that illustrates this principle really well. A student once asked his master how to remain calm amidst uncertainty. The master poured water into a cup, allowing it to overflow. And as he did so, he explained, just as water naturally adapts to the shape of its container, so must you flow with the changes of life without resisting. Now, another thing to do is you need to develop a growth mindset. Viewing life's challenges as opportunities for learning and evolution instead of seeing it as threats to stability and identity. Identity changes. I'm not the person I was 10, 15, 20 years ago. Again, let me draw on Zen here, because there's a beautiful little story, and many of you will recognize this because it's really well spoken of. So there was a farmer who experienced a whole bunch of events that most of the people around him considered either good or bad. His neighbours always had an opinion about things. So, when his horse ran away and then returned with more horses, right? At first, when the horse ran away, his neighbour said, "Oh, that's bad." But then when the horse came back with more horses, that was good. When his son was injured, everyone felt for him and said that was a bad thing to happen. It was, an accident, but, how bad was that? But what happened was, because he was injured, this spared him from going to war. Now, throughout each event, the farmer simply responded, good, bad, who knows? Essentially what this teaches us is the power of seeing life events as neutral opportunities for growth and learning. So finally, we need to practice self-care. Regularly prioritize your physical and emotional being. That, of all things, will begin to ensure your ongoing emotional resilience. So here are some practical steps that you can put in place, both mentally, emotionally, that will begin to help you on your journey to heal from whatever emotional wounds you have. We will always carry the scar. It's a bit like lines in your face. They show that you have truly lived and lived fully. So, in closing, again, as always, let me thank you for joining me on what I consider to be the beginning of a deeply meaningful exploration. Remember, you need to be patient with yourself. You need to be compassionate with yourself. Healing unfolds uniquely for everyone, always in its own time. Healing emotional wounds requires the courage to acknowledge past traumas and the wisdom in seeking support and the strength in developing adaptability. It just doesn't emerge out of the blue. It is an active, intentional process in which you, as the individual, need to nurture your authority, your autonomy, and your agency. Remember, the goal is never perfection, but continual progress towards deeper understanding and emotional resilience, and that will help you to evolve. Now, if today's episode resonated with you, please rate, follow, and share Inspire Change with Gunter. Next week, I'm going to pick up on another topic. Right now, as of right now, I'm not quite sure what that is, but I'm sure the universe provides. So until then, this is me signing off, reminding you to embrace your unique journey with compassion, imperfections, and all that comes with it. Stay inspired. Love to hear from you. And if you're interested, please check out my work on www.gunterswoboda.com or www.goodmengreat.com.
Thank you for listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. For more information on the Making Good Men Great movement, or for individual or group coaching sessions with Gunter, visit goodmengreat.com.